Team Alpha 3 calling HQ. Over.
Go ahead. Over.
Body of a young female found on bridle path on Gunn Hill. Matches description of missing woman. Can we have forensics and a coroner down here, please?
Acknowledged.
Hello and welcome back to Prasha's Murder Map. This episode follows on from the previous one where I covered the Pottery Cottage murders that took place in 1977, which became known as the Year of the Knife. Please check out that episode if you haven't already. This is a separate crime which took place less than a month after that event and under 30 miles away, so although they both took place in the Peak District in the same year, this can be listened to as a standalone episode. The afternoon of Friday 25th of February 1977 started as a normal one for 61-year-old Rita Allshaw. She had wrapped up warmly and taken her dog for a walk as she usually did through a bleak moorland area known as Gunn Hill, located between Rushton Spencer and Meerbrook in the county of Staffordshire on the outskirts of England's Peak District National Park. As she walked, wondering how much the temperatures would drop later that night and if the swollen white clouds were threatening more snow, she saw a van parked on the narrow track which was normally only used by pedestrians. As she squeezed past it, she glimpsed a man and a young woman huddled together in the back of the van, partially covered by a rug. The only details she had time to register were the woman's blonde hair and the man's dark beard, although she did see that the man was holding the girl's neck tightly. Assuming they were a couple wanting privacy, she averted her eyes and continued her walk. She bumped into her neighbour Stanley Keeling, who was also out on a chilly moorland dog walk. It was quite unusual to see a van up there on the hill, so it came up in conversation as they briefly chatted. Stanley said he had seen the same vehicle being driven along the track to the spot where Rita had just passed it, and he had noticed that it was a dark blue Ford Escort van. After Rita and Stanley parted ways, Stanley spotted the van again about 30 minutes later and saw that the man with the dark beard was driving it, but there were no passengers. The man was driving at a normal pace and looked relaxed, so the two dog walkers thought no more of it until much later. What neither of them had seen was the man dragging the young woman out of the van and pulling her towards a dry stone wall near the 11 Lane End's bridle path. She was wearing a maroon knee-length skirt, a grey polo neck sweater and a black cardigan, but she had no winter coat to protect her from the bitter wind that swept across the open landscape. 15 miles away in Prestbury, a quiet affluent village nestled above the River Bowlin with a population of just 3,000, customers were waiting for Williams & Glynn's bank to reopen after the lunch break. It was always shut between 12 and 1, but it was now 1:10 and there was no movement inside. They knew that a new manager had been appointed only that week, a young man by the name of Ian Jebb, and they wondered if he had lost track of time. The customers who were anxious to make deposits or withdraw money called the bank's sister branch in Macclesfield from a telephone kiosk to find out what was going on. Staff at Macclesfield were concerned and confirmed there was no planned closure that day. They tried calling the Prestbury branch but got no answer. They contacted the post office, who confirmed that the phone lines were operational, then asked staff from estate agent J.R. Bridgeford to take a look, as they had officers in the adjoining premises. The estate agent found that the bank was locked up and the window blinds were down, as if it had been abandoned. 2 senior members of staff from the Macclesfield branch arrived in Prestbury just before 2 p.m. and gained access with a master key. The scene inside the building answered their questions about why their colleagues had been uncontactable, but it raised many more. They immediately pressed the alarm button, which would summon police to the bank in a matter of minutes. As they waited for them to arrive, they knew they would not easily forget the sickening details of the sight in front of them. The walls and counter were covered in blood, and behind the counter, 22-year-old manager Ian Jebb lay slumped on his back, his hands bound. By now, police cars had pulled up outside the bank to the surprise of the waiting customers, and the officers ran inside. PC John Davis checked Ian's pulse and tried to administer first aid, but it was too late. The young man was dead. The bank staff were devastated. They knew Ian well, as he had worked for Williams & Glyn's at the Macclesfield branch since leaving school and had started his new job at Prestbury with eager determination just 4 days ago. They looked around for 19-year-old bank clerk Susan Hockenhull, who worked alongside Ian Jebb, but she was nowhere to be found. Her handbag and coat still hung in the staff room at the back of the office, so wherever she had gone she must have been in a hurry or been taken against her will. Bank officials confirmed that the sum of £2,444 was missing. PC Davis radioed headquarters with the distressing news that there had been a murder and a suspected kidnapping at the bank. Later in the afternoon, Dr. Geoffrey Garrett arrived to take photographs and arrange for Ian's body to be transported to West Park Hospital for a post-mortem. Dr. Garrett later wrote in his notes, "I arrived and was shown Ian's body lying face up behind the counter in pools of blood with splashes under the counter and on the wall behind his head. A cloth gag made from torn strips of a blue sheet was across his mouth, secured with a single knot below the left ear, and his hands had been tied behind his back with twin Felix electrical cable." A team of police officers joined PC Davis, led by Detective Superintendent Arthur Morris. They questioned the waiting customers, curious members of the public and frightened staff from nearby businesses who were gathering outside in disbelief that something like this could happen in their tranquil village. Witnesses recalled seeing a man enter the bank shortly before lunchtime, while others had noticed a man guiding a young woman into a dark blue van. Police officers drove to the homes of the young bank employees and informed their parents as gently as they could, but nothing could soften the blow they had been dealt. Roy Jebb wept as he identified his son's body at the hospital mortuary, unable to comprehend how the world could be such a cruel place. Ian had been alive and well at breakfast time that morning as he got ready for his 5th day in his new job, a prestigious position for such a young man. He had everything to look forward to and had been planning to marry his fiancée Avis in 6 months' time. Susan's parents, David and Violet Hockenhull, still clung to hope that their daughter would be found alive. She was quiet and hard-working, known to the locals as Smiling Susan for her happy demeanour when helping customers. She had been working at the Prestbury branch of Williams & Glyn's for just over a year, and she lived with her parents, 12-year-old sister Diane and dog Peppy, in a bungalow at Middlemoss Farm, Gawsworth, about 5 miles from the bank. It was so rural that they didn't have a telephone, so the family spent the night with relatives nearby so they could be reached immediately if there was any news. David Hockenhull tearfully told reporters, "I can't believe anyone would want to harm Susan. She's such a nice girl, so pleasant and quiet." Roadblocks were set up and police searched the village meticulously. They were working on the assumption that Susan had been taken hostage and made an appeal in the media for anyone who may be holding her against her will to give themselves up. Through his own grief, Roy Jebb added his voice to their pleas, urging the kidnapper to think of Susan's family. He knew only too well what the Hockenhulls were going through. Dr. Garrett had completed his post-mortem and delivered the grisly news that Ian had been beaten around the head with a blunt object before being tied, gagged and stabbed 5 times in the chest with a 4-inch blade. The only small mercy was that his death had been swift due to catastrophic blood loss. By the following day, civilian volunteers had joined 70 police officers in the hunt for missing bank clerk Susan Hockenhull. They combed the wild moorland and woods of the Peak District while members of Stockport Caving Club helped to search disused copper and lead mines. Everyone was gravely concerned. They knew that Susan had been marched out of the bank without her winter coat and temperatures had dropped to well below zero overnight. Around lunchtime, 24 hours after the bank robbery, an anonymous phone call was received at police headquarters. The gruff-voiced caller said, "Just listen. Susan the clerk is behind the old railway line up near Rudyard Lake." Then abruptly hung up. As a side note, Rudyard Lake is actually named after the author Rudyard Kipling. I believe it was where he met his wife. Police were immediately dispatched to search the area around the 2.5-mile lake. On a bleak bridle path on Gunn Hill, the searchers found what they had been dreading.
Team Alpha 3 calling HQ, over.
Go ahead, over.
Body of a young female found on bridle path on Gunn Hill. Matches description of missing woman. Can we have forensics and a coroner down here, please?
Acknowledged.
The body of a woman lay hidden behind a dry stone wall, completely covered in ice. She had been tightly bound with torn scraps from a brown jacket and a blue jumper. Her hands were secured behind her back and connected to her neck, so that if she had tried to struggle, she would have choked. Her ankles were also tied, and she had been gagged, preventing her from crying out for help. Pathologist Alan Usher confirmed that it was Susan Hockenhull. There were pink patches around her joints and swollen ankles, with bruising on her legs that suggested she'd been bound elsewhere and then dragged to the spot where she died. But there were no other marks of violence, and there had been no sexual assault. Examination revealed edema of the lungs along with ulcers in the stomach lining, signifying that the cause of death was exposure to the elements. The 19-year-old had frozen to death in temperatures as cold as -14 degrees Celsius, which would have felt colder still due to the bitter wind blowing across the desolate moors. The following Monday morning, Williams and Glyn's bank offered a £50,000 reward for any information leading to the arrest and conviction of Ian and Susan's killer. Police theorised that the perpetrator was local and wondered if he had deliberately targeted his victims, as it seemed odd that he had chosen a small rural branch where there would be less money kept in the vault than at a bank in a major town. They surmised that Ian Jebb had been killed for trying to activate the panic alarm with his feet, and the robber had panicked, grabbed the cash and taken Susan with him as a hostage, which must have been a spur-of-the-moment decision as he had not brought any rope to tie her and was forced to use torn pieces of clothing. The only possible reason the robber could have had for killing the 2 young bank workers was to prevent them revealing his identity if they had recognised him. Otherwise he could simply have subdued them rather than committing murder. It also puzzled police that he had left Susan to die a horrifying, lonely death of hypothermia rather than stabbing her as he did Ian. Is it possible that the killer wasn't entirely comfortable with adding another murder to his list of crimes and harboured the belief that she would eventually be found alive? Could it be that plunging a knife into a young woman was a line that he wasn't willing to cross? Just yards from Susan's body, detectives found an important clue: a scrap of an invoice with the name K. James written in red ink. The invoice was traced to a company that serviced time locks and adding machines for banks, and K. James was one of the directors who confirmed that Williams & Glynn's bank was one of their clients. The employee who serviced the Pressbury machines was 30-year-old David Walsh, who lived in nearby Macclesfield with his wife Linda. On 28th of February, David was arrested while police interviewed his neighbours to find out as much as they could about him. When they all mentioned that David had bought a new Mini Cooper that weekend, along with a radio cassette player, expensive jewellery, clocks and a guitar, everything fell into place. They soon uncovered that Walsh was behind on his rent and owed large sums of money on a motorcycle, a Rover car and a personal loan. They had found a motive. Walsh was interviewed for 32 hours and was unable to explain where he had gotten the money for his lavish purchases. But they didn't need a confession. Hidden under the floorboards in his home, police found various sums of money in 50p and 10p pieces, along with £31 in new notes, with serial numbers in a sequence that was part of a shipment delivered to the bank 2 days earlier. Forensic scientists also matched a bloody boot print from the scene to Walsh's footwear, and on the Monday following the murders, David's wife Linda had paid their overdue rent using notes from the sequence money just a day before they were due to be evicted from their home by bailiffs. Apparently, Walsh had even told one of his neighbours that if he ever robbed a bank, it would be Williams & Glynn's in Pressbury, because he went there regularly to service their machines and he knew that security was lax. David Walsh had been the youngest of triplets, none of whom had a happy start to life as they were abandoned by their parents and sent to live in children's homes. David's two brothers were academically bright and led productive lives, but David struggled at school and changed jobs frequently, trying his hand as a car wash attendant, apprentice welder and a machine operator for the coal board. His attendance and attitude were poor, and he didn't stay with any of his employers for long. He joined the army in 1963 and enlisted with the Royal Engineers, but they found him undesirable and discharged him from service. It was around this time that David began to get into trouble for cheque fraud and vehicle theft, and he was unemployed for long periods, but by 1972 he seemed to have turned things around, enjoying his new job, repairing adding machines in businesses and banks, which were the mechanical precursors to calculators. Nonetheless, having a more stable job didn't stop him accruing debt. He had a taste for fast cars and quick rewards, and if he liked something that he couldn't afford, he would steal it rather than save up for it. In the year leading up to the murders, Walsh had borrowed money for a Ford Escort van, 2 Austin cars, a Honda motorcycle and a luxury sound system, but had sold them all and pocketed the money without paying back the loans. Walsh might have been poor at holding down jobs and managing money, but one thing he was good at was spinning a yarn. He told people he was a successful musician and was friends with David Bowie and Rod Stewart, and came up with absurd explanations for how he had come into larger sums of money over the weekend. He claimed that not only had he sold items to a second-hand dealer and received a gift of £500 from his brother, but a generous investor had also given him £700 to help set him up in business. He even tried to convince the jury that the blood found on the sole of his boot had come from a boy who had hurt himself, who Walsh had supposedly tried to help. On 20th of October 1977, David Walsh was found guilty of the murders of Ian Jebb and Susan Hockenhull, as well as the robbery of the Pressbury Bank. He received a life sentence with a recommendation from the judge that he remain in prison for a minimum of 25 years. On 1st of April 2003, he collapsed and died in his cell at the age of 57. It had been a gruesome and shocking start to the year, with the killing of the bank staff taking place just 1 month after the terrifying Pottery Cottage home invasion and multiple murders only 30 miles away. Newspapers were quick to sensationalise 1977 as the year of the knife, and people in the area were full of apprehension about what lay ahead. Thankfully, the events of January and February appeared to be tragic anomalies for the Peak District area, although the rest of the year was anything but ordinary for the UK and was dotted with IRA bombs, violent clashes between the National Front and anti-Nazi protesters, firefighters and morticians' strikes, and the continuation of the Yorkshire Rippers' reign of terror. In 1985, Williams and Glynn's bank ceased to trade and was absorbed into its parent company, the Royal Bank of Scotland, RBS. RBS continued trading in the same building until 2018, which it shared with the Pressbury Library. It's now an estate agent called Fine & Country, but the library remains. There's no visible sign of the building's sombre past, but the shadows of the murders still hang over the village, along with the memory of how the lives of two families were changed forever when Susan Hockenhull and Ian Jebb went to work one morning and never came home. Thank you for listening to this episode of Prash's Murder Map. This case was taken from my true crime book Murder Casebook Volume 2. I know times are tough for a lot of us right now, but there are several ways you can support the show if you're able to. I'm proud that the podcast is 100% independent and is researched, written and produced by myself and my wife from our spare bedroom, so any help is greatly appreciated. Please subscribe and consider leaving me a review wherever you get your podcasts, or share the show with a friend. Or you can make a one-off donation via PayPal to prashasmurdermap@gmail.com, or buy me a coffee at ko-fi.com/prashasmurdermap. Alternatively, if you would like to contribute on an ongoing basis, you can do that through Patreon, so please feel free to check out the link in the show notes and see what rewards are on offer in return for your support. Thank you. I also have an audiobook available on Audible, Murder Casebook Volume 1, a collection of 12 shocking true crime cases narrated by British actor Mark Rice-Oxley, so please check that out if you're looking for a new audiobook. You can find all the links in the show notes. For news about my books and free true crime blog posts, check out my website www.prashganandran.com. I really appreciate your support, and I'll see you again soon.